because it's going to be out in paperback in October, and I'll make be inspired to order a copy after the chat. I'm really pleased to see so many folks here. I know you've had a lot of other options. At this time, there's been some great things going on here. I spoke here prior to the COVID days on a wonderful panel, and I live right in Cambridge, Massachusetts, so it's an easy drive. So, what I want to talk to you today about is a sort of strange intersection of technology and the occult and the supernatural. And what's interesting is, often when we're dealing with, when writers or critics or scholars or whoever, practitioners are dealing with the subject related to the occult and the supernatural, we often feel that we have to sort of pick a side, like there's this binary thing about whether it's real or whether it's not real, whether it's true or false. One is there's pressure sometimes to either be wholly skeptical or wholly a believer. Something needs to be proved or disproved. And I think one of the great things about a conference like this, dealing with the intersection of literature and the arts and the weird, is it really is about those liminal spaces. It really is about these spaces of ambiguity where true and false don't really matter anymore. Whether something's true in a demonstrable, measurable way, or whether it can be false, whether it can be measured as false, really is not of value, I think, in some ways, for something like the kinds of things that people are discussing this weekend. And so for myself, exactly the same. I'm not here to try to prove to you that the soul lives after death and that photographs can be taken of those souls. But I am absolutely excited and interested in this idea, one, that we would even attempt to take a picture of a deceased person's soul, and all the ways in which our sort of cultural imagination responds to do something like that. And even more interesting, that the science behind, say, a camera, the science that leads, the scientific method that leads to the technology that makes a camera possible is the same method that would tell us that souls do not exist and you cannot take pictures of them. But there's something about the medium of technology that over the decades and centuries in some ways has sort of shifted our understanding of how technology is actually a distinct entity in some ways, a distinct field from science, that it can be manipulated, it can be hacked. And that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about hacking and how people, and how magic, if you will, is an attempt to kind of hack the numinous to create some result in the phenomenal world, right? I mean, that sort of the famous Aleister Crowley's dictum, magic is the art and science of causing change to occur in the world, is a hack. So the first thing I like to think about what I'm talking about today with you is it's really just a map. It's just a way of trying to understand our relationship to, let's call it, for a better word, the numinous. The occult and the supernatural are just maps. They're just ways of navigating sort of through a cultural and spiritual landscape. This is the Sephirotic tree from the Jewish Kabbalistic tradition. And this is literally a map. It's a map for the mystic to make their way through the Sephirot into the Godhead. And it's also a map for God to make its way through its own emanations into the world. This is another map. This is sort of a hermetic alchemical map. another way of thinking about a sort of structure from how the human interacts with the spiritual, interacts with the numinous. And then we have a map like this, which is a way of interacting with sound, just a schematic. This actually happens to be a schematic for a device intended to capture spirit voices using a technique called which is a sort of an idea called electronic voice phenomena, which we'll talk about today. Technology, though, has always, almost immediately, with almost every new way of interacting with our world using technology, immediately inspires trying to understand it in its relationship to our spiritual lives. The very first, one of the very first televisions was from a company called Clue. This was in 1934. This was the TV advertisement. This was the advertisement for the new television set. A wonder of technology. But instead of highlighting the incredible science behind the technology, it focused on this sort of notion of witches, the magic mirror, the strangest dream that man has ever dreamed. It is here, the magic eye, the enchanted mirror, the fantastic dream of ancient witches who were burnt for their dreaming. Television, youngest, strangest, most intriguing of all, the miracles of science. Not even the incredible engineering work of scientists, but rather this very definitive language of tying this new understanding of how we can perceive reality and using this spiritual, and more than that, this mystical, supernatural language, tying it to the idea of witches, to something that might have actually been forbidden, right? The television, of course, is one of the first places I like to think about because it was where I first, myself, growing up, saw this weird cultural way of talking about technology and supernatural. And it was in the film The Poltergeist, Tobe Hooper film, produced by Spielberg. And this is how the entities ultimately make their way into the home, is through that ubiquitous television set that is in everybody's home. Right? This isn't a weird thing that this family happens to have. And the fact that it's even in the parents' bedroom was starting to show sort of how much it was just so much a part of everybody's life. You would have a TV in the kitchen and so forth. Spirits that are hacking the family's television set be able to actually talking to my friend Ezra on the way up here about sort of what was interesting about sort of 60s counterculture was there was both this desire to get people back to sort of a romantic notion of nature and community, commune, but at the same time there was a sense of the possibilities of the future and of technology. And one of the great examples of this was the Whole Earth catalog. This is a 1968 historic brand. Started this, and for those that don't know, was really a catalog of wonderful things. Geodesic domes and how to build gardens, early computer, but also how to roll the I Ching and use tarot cards. And I was struck when I was doing the research, thinking about these things, and stumbled upon this book where he says, we are as gods and might as well get good at it. So this notion is actually, I think, a very American one. It's a very Protestant notion, right? That our salvation is measured by our worldly success in some ways, by our industry, by our ability to invent, to engineer, to make new things. And that's what sort of creates this interaction in many ways with the divine. It's not good works in terms of the forms of charity. It's industry that then creates jobs, and then that is what is sort of the charitable way in which, quote, money trickles down, right? But it's a religious idea, it's a spiritual idea at its core. This idea that we would be able to, when I step away from the microphone, people still hear me? Because I have a tendency to sit down, sorry. Very far back, we started to think about how is it that our re-engineering of the tools around us, of what we have on hand, can allow us to have this relationship to the spirit world, to our relationship with God, to the divine. These are a collection of the magician and astrologer John Dee. This is a spirit mirror. This is, you can see this was put on the table, and that was the speculum, which was like a shoe stone or a seam stone. And he used this to supposedly communicate with angels and record what was called the Enochian language. And he had a friend named Kelly, who was the medium who would sort of dictate the information. And ultimately that information was that they should share wives. So there's always that little tidbit of where a lot of this stuff sometimes ends up. What's really wonderful about, so these are just, tools. It doesn't seem to be anything that's necessarily technology here, except that it's exactly a piece of technology in the way that it was understood. There was an angel that called itself Nalvage, and it confirmed for him this idea that this was actually a piece of technology. The angel says, as the ear is the chief sense, so being infected, it is the greatest hindrance. Many there be that thrust themselves between you and me, which is this object, and they are increased. It's a hearing aid to hear the world of the spirits and to be able to dictate their knowledge that will ultimately save mankind. Joseph Smith, founder of Mormonism, was also, for those who don't know, and I was very pleasantly surprised to discover this, that Joseph Smith and his sort of clan, before they were Mormons, were excellent magicians. And they use divining rods and they use seeing stones to treasure hunt. There's a great tradition in especially in the magical grimoire tradition, the book of the magician's spells and instructions on how to conjure and invoke angels and demons, of treasure hunting. That often the reason why you would call an angel or a demon was to show you where the treasure is buried. And Joseph Smith was one of these treasure hunters, using shoe stones, using divining rods. And there is, and the Mormons themselves, this is not, covered up history. They're a version of these at the Latter-day Saints sort of museum, the collection. And these are supposedly a representation of the stones that Joseph Smith used to carry in a little bag. And when he was given the golden plates by the angel that was in this angelic language, he fashioned a pair of spectacles using these shoe stones, these seam stones, to be able to read it. And believe it or not, the Mormons there's a whole subculture of Mormons that are transhumanists. And they believe that part of their becoming like gods, just like from the Whole Earth catalog, is to embrace a sort of technological, techno-human future. That's what heaven's going to be ultimately, because we will lose our perfect body. The body will be corrupted, but we can change that with technology, and we can enter when we are risen with these specialized tools that we have made as part of our destiny, right? Our technological destiny. One of the great early examples of, I think, of technology and our trying to engineer something to get us closer to God is, I think, the story of the golem. I'm sure a lot of you have heard the story of the golem. Essentially, it was believed to be a technique whereby a rabbi or a mystic could fashion a creature, a humanoid out of clay, would inscribe a secret name on its forehead or in a scroll that would be placed into its mouth, and it would come to life. And the great story, of course, is the Golem of Prague, that was created in order to help the Jews from the pogroms and from the destruction of their villages by, fortunately, by Christians, right? But the golem goes mad, he can't control it, and there's a couple of really wonderful tales about how the Rabbi Loeb usually has to stop the golem. My favorite is the golem becomes so tall that he has to climb up a ladder and erase the name on its forehead, and it crumbles and crushes him. There's also a story that the Golem of Prague is still hidden, in a synagogue in the attic, and that when we're ready, it will be presented back to the Jews. If you look at the earliest texts, though, the earliest mystical texts that describe the creation of the golem, it turns out that the creation of the golem is supposed to be your entrance exam for gaining the true mystical, magical knowledge that the angel Raziel will deliver to you. So it's sort of like you have to prove that you are capable of doing this singular thing, and once you do that, then you'll be given the great gifts. This is a still from the wonderful film, Der Golem, or The Golem, how he came into the world, 1920, the German director Paul Wegener. You can actually see the whole thing on YouTube. It's a wonderful, strange film. The golem is ultimately tamed by a group of blonde, angelic, almost Teutonic-looking young women. Sort of strange within that movie. This notion of artificial life, though, is really an amazing way of thinking about, again, how we were trying to create this intersection, how we're trying to be able to take on to ourselves godly powers to reshape the universe. And so one of the amazing things with the invention of the clockwork mechanism were automatons. These are the three famous automatons by Pierre Jacques Rose and his son Henry Louis, 1768 to 1774 these were created. And they're meant to do two things. They were meant to showcase the skill of the horologist, but they were trying to describe something essential about the human being. Descartes was the one who basically came up with this idea that we are physically just automata that God had fashioned, and the soul is sort of what drives us. But there's nothing really, the body itself is just a mechanism, and why can't human beings create a mechanism in kind to sort of do the imitatio Dei, to sort of imitate God and to do the work of creation? But the consequence of this was where the power to drive these constructs comes from. Because so this automaton writes, his sister plays the harpsichord, there's another one that plays the flute. But it was believed that only human beings, given a soul and a creative spirit by God, could do things like write and make music and play music. And so if human beings make these toys and they're able to do the same thing, people began to be afraid that it had to be the devil. There had to be some infernal source of power that was making these. There's a sort of an apocryphal story of an automaton, of a horologist who made an automaton. The French Inquisition arrested him, arrested the automaton, and put the automaton on trial to get it to admit that it was a creature of the devil. The story is they didn't have the key to wind it up because they didn't know that that was the trick behind it. This is a wonderful look at this automaton, the writing automaton. Everybody see that okay? I mean, imagine in the mid-1700s seeing this, and even with the understanding that it was made by a human being, the fact that it could do something like write caused all kinds of fears and superstitions, and created what Freud would write about, called the uncanny valley. Right? The uncanny valley is something that I think is also a really interesting place where kind of the weird intersects, right, with the things that I'm talking about right now, because there's this sense of it is sort of something familiar, and yet it's responding in a way that it really shouldn't, and it just feels like reality is somehow breaking down or is getting twisted in a way that we don't quite feel on solid ground, but I look around and everything is still stable, except there's something here that it just doesn't quite make sense. And for many, if you were already living in a time when people were particularly superstitious, despite, Enlightenment ideas and new technologies, there was a feeling that there was something infernal happening here. But for the horologist, for somebody like, these automaton makers, God is the maker. God is an artisan, an architect, and his methods and his tools can be repurposed. This is sort of the as above, so below, taken to sort of its mechanical sort of understanding. Magic isn't breaking the world, but utilizing what's available, which is kind of what the hacker does, right? I mean, the hacker has to sort of, they have to, lose their warranty, right? They're purposely going to break the thing to make it do something that it's not supposed to do. Paine, the American philosopher, said, the true deist, and this is again comes out of the deist notion of the clockwork universe, God is the great clockmaker, winds it up, sets it in motion. The true deist has but one deity, and his religion consists of contemplating the power, wisdom, and benignity of the deity in his works, and endeavoring to imitate him in everything, moral, scientifical, and mechanical. So by creating something like an automaton is really just doing what we're supposed to be doing. That's the imitatio Dei. It is moral, but morality is only one small part of it. One of the interesting things when thinking about technology is, and the supernatural, is we start to unpack a couple of different things. You have technology which is used to try to interact with the divine, like John Dee's Shoestone, trying to interact with the supernatural, with the unseen forces of the world. You have technology that is used which will seek to trick people into thinking that there is a supernatural reality. And then you have technology which is used to debunk those that are trying to fool others using technology. But there's this really interesting space in between those, which really is the beginnings in many ways of film and television, but it's really the beginning of film. There was a fellow named George Schroepfer in 1700s who was a mason and a magician, and he liked to stage initiatory rites in his living room. He would have people come, and he would give them something to drink, which now people think he might have dosed with something, and he would put on plenty of incense and make everybody feel really dizzy, and he would construct the magic circle, and then people would start to see spirits appear. And they were already kind of high, and they were already kind of dizzy, and he would use these techniques as an initiatory device. What he was doing was using a magic lantern. And the magic lantern really is one of the early motion picture devices. But it was meant to induce in the people who watched it an experience that they were encountering the spirit world. They would stage these things called phantasmagorias. That's where that term comes from. And they were staged in crypts, and the images were often sort of these grotesque. This is an example of Gaspard Robert and his Phantasmagoria. What he did was very simple. Originally, it was just a projection on a wall. And what Robert realized you could do is you could put it on wheels, and you could move it back and forth, and it would make the images get bigger and smaller. It's just like the zoom lens on the projector. But he saw, oh my gosh, I mean, people would flip out when these things would come so close to screen and then be pulled back. I don't know what that's doing. Again, they would set the stage. It wasn't just like being in a movie theater. It wasn't just about being dark. You were already in a crypt. Again, there might be incense. Just a whole sense of creating this completely immersive experience to induce this state of altered, kind of supernatural consciousness. Oh, hey, I heard that. That's perfect. First mimic, somebody said. This idea of using this in a sort of theatrical way, and the idea of initiation was really combined to great effect with something called Pepper's Ghost. And this was in 1879, and you can look this up, patent number 221,605 is the United States patent titled Improvement in Apparatus for Producing Optical Illusions. And what essentially was done here is you would have the stage on a raised platform with a piece of glass in front of the stage, and you would have somebody below the stage projecting a person in like a ghost costume, and then that would reflect back up here, so it would appear as if there was a spectral spirit on stage. And again, what's wonderful about this is it wasn't supposed to be hidden. This wasn't a secret thing. You could look up the patent, you go to the patent office and read all about it. But it brings us back really to the important idea of how technology and supernatural have often interacted, how the occult have often interacted, is very much just the way in which we interact, say, with a stage magician, which is that the intention is to have a sort of initiatory experience where we know it's a trick, insofar as we know there's some technology or something behind it, and yet we go there to allow ourselves to be taken through this really initiation. I mean, it's very much the techniques of something like the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. It's very much what Freemasons have been doing, right? It's creating these ritual moments of which you are either watching or interacting with some kind of theatrical performance, and by bearing witness to it, you are initiating. Right? You don't have to even actually do the ritual, but just seeing it allows you to now become an initiator. And we decided there's no reason not to do this all the time. Nothing really has changed. This is from the film Paranormal Activity. It's just a magic lantern. Really interesting about Paranormal Activity is it's this sort of reframing where we are seeing the video of the experience as opposed to being inside of it, right? So you get that one step removed. I mean, it's sort of the found footage, obviously the found footage idea, but it still functions as the same way in terms of being a witness to this thing. This is just a quick thing I wanted to show you, which is Pepper's ghost being used on stage. This was a more modern. So this is what you would see as an audience in a theater, not a movie theater, but a regular stage theater. I mean, it's pretty good. Some people try to use these techniques to, maybe take your money or for other benefits. And Harry Houdini, if you know the story of Harry Houdini, who loved his mother and he was trying to find a medium who could help him communicate with her, he really did want that. And so he set out trying to find a medium that could do that. And all he found were people that were hucksters. And so he wrote a book called The Magician Among the Spirits, wonderful title, in which he basically demonstrates all the different techniques, some of them, these mechanical techniques that people use to make it appear as if there was a spirit in the room. This is one of the great ones that shows how a table knocking, that was a big thing, especially in the early days of spiritualism, where the rapping, the spirits would rap. Hello, is there a spirit here? One, no. Well, I wouldn't say no, but. And so this was a technique where, with just clicking their heel, it would, let a little piston go up, and it would load a hammer, and it would hit the top of the table. It would hit the bottom side of the table. Reginald Scott, as far back as 1584, was already finding out some of these techniques of how some of these things were being done. And again, sort of using these very crude kinds of forms of technology. I mean, we look at something like, we can watch a movie like Paranormal Experience. You can be in the theater and you can kind of be enveloped by that and be enchanted by it. But this worked. I mean, people were really believed that there were spirits in their midst, that they were answering questions via these rappings. But there were still people who, I think, earnestly wanted this to be true. What's really strange, what I find the strangest of all of this, just really thinking about human nature, is that there are people who believed so much and so wanted to be able to convince others that they would hoax folks, not because they were trying to dupe them, but because they wanted them to believe the thing that they believed, but they couldn't do it otherwise. I think that's in many ways what we saw with something like spirit photography, especially around the Civil War. Spirit photography really took off during the Civil War. It was, it's one thing to be a Christian, it's one thing to go to church and be told by the minister or by the priest that your youngest son, who was killed in the war, is waiting for you in heaven. But the trauma of that war and the trauma of losing really young men to that, it just wasn't enough of a comfort. People wanted more. They really wanted to hear and be able to have something more. And so the boom in spiritualism in particular, but also in spirit photography, was something that was really an answer to that trauma. Again, it's not just about somebody, trying to swindle. There was a sense of something was happening between the photographer and those in the warning that I think is very complicated, even though, of course, somebody's being duped. There's a very famous photograph of Mary Lincoln Todd sitting for a portrait, and there's the spirit of her husband, Abraham Lincoln. She was a devout spiritualist. She was actually committed. There was a lot of it, and there was some problems with the estate and whose money was whose money, and members of the family were able to get her committed, and they used her belief in spiritualism and things like this, to say that she was nuts. And it was actually the sort of allies of spiritualists in America were the suffragists. And it was because mainly in spiritualism was one of the only religions really where women acted in sort of leadership positions because they were the mediums. They were the ones who were communicating with the spirits. And so there was this wonderful, really important alliance between the suffragettes and the spiritualists. And it was the suffragettes that actually helped Mary Lincoln Todd get out of sort of this situation where she had been committed. This is a photo of an etching of a group called the Davenport Brothers around this time, and they would stage magic. They were magic shows. They were traveling magicians, but they would stage their magic shows as if they were spiritualist seances. So they would use all the, and there's this really amazing thing. There's a catalog for magicians where they could buy things like these spirit cabinets and things that would make the instruments float. And these catalogs were used also by mediums. This is where they would also buy things like their spirit boxes, to be able to do similar kinds of things. The Davenport brothers are very cheeky. They, people would say, how do you able to do what you are doing? And they say, we cannot reveal the source of our secret powers, but know that we are allied with the powers far beyond those of you being able to understand. But they were close the cabinet. They'd be completely tied up. Close the cabinet, open it, they're untied. Close the cabinet. The lights go down, the instruments float, the horns, the spirit horns float. You can still do those today. There's still mediums today that are doing those kind of performative things. What's interesting though is the spiritualists themselves would start to dismiss a lot of that, and they do not like the Church of Spiritualism today. If you go to a place like Lilydale in upstate New York, they don't want this kind of theatrical stuff. They feel that either it's not real or it too closely associates them with the occult, the supernatural. They're very straight. People have died, you can communicate with them, a medium can help you talk to your loved ones. They don't do tarot cards, they don't want anything that, it's very conservative in that regard. But for a long time, the techniques of spirit photography were very much aligned with those of spiritualism. Another famous Mumler was the Boston photographer who took this and also took the Mary Lincoln Con photographs. These next two photographs are by a current photographer named Shannon Taggart. You might have heard of her or seen her work. She spends a lot of time in Lilydale and she photographs mediums. What's interesting about Shannon is she also is a hacker. She purposefully misuses her camera. She will, she'll have the shutter open for too long to let in light in interesting ways. And what's very interesting is I worked with her, I sort of followed her, and there's an interesting thing that happens here. And again, this goes to just, I think, the way our imaginations work when we're interacting with these kind of realities. A medium, like this woman here, will say, I'm going to go into a trance and you will probably see the spirit surrounding me. Shannon will be taking a photograph. You're sitting there watching her and you don't see anything. She just looks like a woman throwing her head back and her eyes will roll back in her head. She's going to start telling you some things about somebody who's done. But Shannon doesn't manipulate the photo. She just misuses the camera. She takes the camera and she lets the shutter open for too long. And then when you go and you look at the camera, when you look at the film, after she developed it or even on a digital camera, these strange effects appear that now upon reflection seem to suggest on the photograph what the medium had told you you were going to see when you were there, but you didn't. It wasn't until the camera allowed that reality to transform on the film. And what's very interesting about this is, for the early spirit photographers, there's a wonderful idea that spirits are it's not that you have to be somewhere at the right place at the right time. The spirits have been waiting for us to invent the camera so that they could finally make themselves known in new ways. They were always around. Before, they had to use dreams, they had to use visions, scene stones, crude ways of communicating with us. Well, when are these goofballs going to finally invent the camera? Then they invent it, and now they can reveal themselves. They're always there. Every new piece of technology allows us to have a new kind of interaction. One of my favorite photographs from the era of spirit photography, this was taken by a fellow named Albert von Schrank-Notzing, who took photographs of ectoplasm. Ectoplasm is this sort of stuff that leads out when the spirit world interacts with ours, sort of like this leftover stuff. Just a beautiful, haunting photograph. He sometimes didn't do such a good job. Here's one of his photographs of a spirit. One of his opponents, somebody who was always, there's always people, of course, especially serious photographers hated spirit photographers. And there were all these debates that would go on in these early photography magazines, and there were all these groups that were trying to undermine the spirit photographers. And one of his opponents was able to show that this photograph was the portrait seen on the cover of a magazine from April 21st, 1912. Le Mirror was the name of the magazine. And this was just some politician face had been, I guess, cut out, maybe, or maybe not, right? So there's always that question of the ambiguity there. So what happened was, Notzine said, you know what, you guys don't understand. I know that this is real. I've seen the ectoplasm, and you know what, it really seems like the camera is just messing things up. I'm not going to take pictures of ectoplasm anymore, because it makes things look fake. If you were here when I took this picture, you would see this doesn't look like this at all. Yes, I admit it looks suspect. So you know what? Forget it. No more photographs. You blew it. This is my favorite. I'll call it a spirit, little spirit moving picture. Same techniques in many ways. So we've talked about film and photography. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about sound. This is a fellow named Constantine Brodai who published an English language translation of a book he wrote in '68 called Grapefruit. And he writes, the tape recorder, radio microphone give us facts in an entirely impersonal way, and their objectivity cannot be challenged, that we can communicate with the spirit world. And his techniques were very simple. He would take create some white noise and put a microphone, set up a microphone and a tape recorder, and then leave the room. My dad gave me one of those. I have one of those wheelchair and I tried to do some of these experiments, which I can talk about those in the book and chat after I can tell you about my experiences. But in any case, not very dramatic. And so Constantine would set up these things, and he had a huge number of these recordings, and inspired an entire field of what we now call electronic voice phenomena. And again, just exactly like the camera, the spirits are always there. They were just waiting for us to put the microphone on in the room with the white noise, and then they could manipulate the frequencies to be able to communicate with us. A friend of mine, this woman, Donna, she is an EVP devotee and one of the great collectors of EVP recordings, and when she was trying to explain it to me, she said, look, these are disembodied consciousness. They don't have voice boxes. So they're not speaking through the ether. They're manipulating, they're hacking the ether, they're hacking the radio waves to be able to send the signals through. Here is an interesting little story.
Hello everybody on the other side. Break through and
there's all kinds of explanations for what that other noise might be and how it found its way into Paradise Tape Recorder after he asks if there's anybody there. But I think what's interesting about this, and I think it's interesting for me to engage with it in this way again, is not to, a lot of this is very easy to disprove. But we're not interested in disproving to you. I'm also not interested in trying to prove anything to you that these, like I said, that these are real. What I want to what I'm hoping that I'm demonstrating here is what happens to our imaginations when we engage with these realities. That something shifts in us. I was recently doing a little, believe it or not, for MIT students. I was teaching them how to roll the I Ching. This was for a course there on the history of divination and magic with a friend of mine, Graham Jones. And, these are engineers and scientists, rationalists for all intents and purposes. And I said, look, is the I Ching real or not real? I can't answer that question. But while we're doing it, let's inhabit a space together where it works. Let's just do that. For this, once you leave, it's fine, it's over. When you go to see the stage magician, you allow yourself to be enchanted by that. It's not allowing yourself to be tricked because you know you're being tricked. That's not, you're not lying to yourself, right? It's about an altered state of consciousness. And I think that's, again, what I'd like to change Crowley's law, using Dion Fortune, another magician from rose out of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, changed Crowley's diction to say, not a change will occur in the world, but a change will occur in consciousness. Right? That's what this does. This acts on us the same way really good art should, the way music, the way literature should. It's about entering into an enchanted state, just following one of these maps that we talked about at the beginning to see where they'll take us. There was a fellow named Frank Sumpton, if you go, I think it's the October 1980 something, you look it up, or I'll try to find it. If anybody wants to give me your email, I'll find it for you. You can find it online. It's a Popular Electronics from the 80s, where they actually describe how to create EVP devices. Okay, and like 2 months later, the letters that came in were just, it was like, how could you possibly try to fool people into thinking that you can communicate with spirits? One guy said that these were all tools of the devil, and that the editors of Popular Electronics were going to be going to hell because they were demonstrating that they could communicate with spirits. But Frank read this article and decided that he was going to create something called a Frank box, and actually made one of these. Essentially what you do is you take an AM/FM radio that has the auto scanning, where it will stop when it hits a station, and there's a little hack where you break it so that it doesn't stop when it hits the frequency that comes in. So it registers almost like a Ouija board, where it just drops you, you hear the thing. And you're supposed to sort of quickly write down what you hear. There's a bunch of people on YouTube that will do this. What's really interesting about those is, think about this, what they're doing here. They will do exactly this. They'll let it register across. They'll take notes, and when they upload the video, they put subtitles. So now what's happened? Anybody want to take a guess what happens when you see the subtitles now? Say again? Exactly, exactly. So what I did was I did an experiment where I closed my eyes, listened to the YouTube video, wrote down what I was hearing, then watched it with the subtitles, usually completely different, but now I couldn't unhear what the subtitles said. I couldn't even hear what I had heard originally, you know? So that bias is very powerful. And so it's a really fun experiment to do though. If you have one of these radios, just to hack it, you get the plans online. If you're good at soldering, you can even just use electrical tape to do it. You have to ruin the radio, but so the last thing I want to talk about, just if we have time for questions. I know there's a lot here. Again, this was like a condensed, both from a book and from what was originally a sort of class. But I hope this was an enjoyable sort of overview of some of the things that I've been thinking about when I was putting these ideas together. So the other technique, somebody's there. The other technique, again, that technology can be thought of doing, is purposefully inducing those altered states of consciousness so that we may interact with the numinous, the spirits, and sun and wind. Brian Geisen, buddies with William Burroughs, surrealist and writer. He was on a bus in Paris, and he was kind of, just having a nice, relaxing bus ride, and the tree-lined streets and the sun, as the bus was going down the street, it was creating what's called a flicker effect through the trees and through the window, and it brought him into this hypnotic, altered state of consciousness. And he was so inspired by this that he thought, well, why don't we make one of these, which he believed, he called the Dream Machine, and he thought it was had culture-altering potential, and may bring about a change in consciousness in so much as it throws back the limits of the visible world, and may indeed prove that there are no limits. So this is, and you can build these again. You can go online, you can get the plans, cut out a big sheet of cardboard, get it together, cut out these designs. You see them here. Put it on a record player. Put a light bulb, hang a light bulb inside of it. You just press your nose right up, and you can have this experience. There is actual scientific evidence that these techniques do elevate alpha wave activity in the brain. Flicker has been used, for hypnotic states. Dyson here saw, again, this technology. This is just another shoe stone, right? It's just going on. It brings us all the way back to John Dee. Just another way of using technology to extend our senses so that we sort of push open the veil, right? Just a little bit and gaze on what's the other side.